Welcome back. You're watching News Center. Globalization remains at a record level despite geopolitical tensions, and the return of a Trump presidency may not necessarily reverse globalization. That's the big takeaway from DHL Global Connectedness Tracker. This report, published every 2 years, strongly challenges the notion that we've entered a period of deglobalization. Overall, in 2023, 21% of the value of all goods and services produced was traded internationally, marginally down from 22% in 2022. US-China ties continue to diminish, with direct trade falling from 3.5% of global goods trade in 2016 to 2.6% in 2024. Decoupling between US and China has led to large trade share gains for countries like UAE, India, Vietnam, Brazil and Mexico. Despite broad regionalization trends, most trade flows are taking place over long distances. We're now joined by John Pearson, Global CEO of DHL Express. John, thank you very much for joining us. Let me begin by asking you about the victory of Trump and the kind of cabinet that we have seen for the White House. It's going to be a presidency, a cabinet that will be hawkish on China. We are going to see a very tough stand vis-a-vis China. So the trade between US and China may go down even further. Considering the developments taking place in the US, how do you think this is going to affect globalization going forward?
Well, I'll try and summarize my answer. We've been in these situations before. In the first Trump administration, I remember in 2019, which was my first year in the job, there were certain heavy tariffs put on the export of Chinese goods to the US. Some of them then were repealed, and we get through these times. It's fair to say we can see an impact of some of these tariffs when they happen. Well, now, but it is not a situation that is unfamiliar to us. We're now going into a new administration that promises lots of things, to be honest with you. One of them will be a 60% on China goods and maybe 10% on all other countries that don't have a free trade agreement. What I know from the Global Connectedness Report and the Global Tracker is trade and globalization is incredibly resilient. It's still globalizing rather than deglobalizing. Water tends to find a way. Trade is rather mercurial. Remember, trade in your mercury in your hand, it moves all over the place. When one door closes, another door opens. Trade will find its way between different partners via somewhere, perhaps to China. So I think we just have to wait until the administration decides on what policies it wants to put in, and then we will adapt to whatever we see. But no one is better positioned to understand global trade and globalization than us, and understand the early impacts of anything and be able to share that with our customers. So we wait like everyone else waits.
Has the US been able to decouple from China to the extent it wanted to do so about 8 to 10 years ago?
I think the first thing you would say about China-US trade is they're both each other's largest trading partner. Trade has come off a little bit from where it was in the peak of the pandemic, and you could imagine some things that were traded in the pandemic, PPE equipment, things related to COVID, really drove that level of integration between the two countries up. It has come back a bit, maybe not to be expected, some of that tariff related, some of it just global trade related, but they are enormously coupled as countries. They both need each other in so many different senses of the word. And my own thoughts for that in the future is it'll be rather incrementalism if it is on the way down, putting aside any rather more dramatic impact of tariffs, which then creates negotiations and discussions. And then those tariffs can quite oftentimes come out. So tariffs aren't always a thing for the future.
Right. Have you also seen countries which are benefiting from the US-China trade war? If China's contribution to global trade has gone down, have any of the countries like India benefited from it?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think back to my point about water always finding a sort of stream to go down to reach the sea, I think there are countries that are benefiting from it. And I'll say it in a couple of different ways. Countries that have no strong alliance to the US and no strong alliance to China have certainly grown their share of world trade over the last 8 years. Mexico, Brazil, UAE, Vietnam, India are 5 great examples of that. No doubt we'll come back to India in a minute. So, in fact, I think I'll pause there with those 2 answers that I give you. Trade always finds a way, so some countries are being the beneficiary. Those that have no strong alliance are definitely growing faster. And then I'd go on to say, countries that are the beneficiary of China plus one and diversification of supply chains into Vietnam, into Indonesia, into the Philippines, into India, not necessarily China diversification. India is benefiting enormously from a very successful national, I call it national logistics policy. I think the terminology may be something slightly different, but building out the infrastructure that makes India attractive for inward and outbound trade and inward investment that delivers that trade. So, hats off to the administration in India for building that trade-friendly environment. I learnt when I was in Delhi earlier in the year that India has attracted more inward FDI than any other country on the planet other than the USA.
So how do you think India is placed to play a bigger role in global supply chain in the months to come? Do you see the kind of orders that you're getting from India, do they show you promise, potential of India's greater role and greater share in global trade going forward?
Emphatically, yes. I am lucky enough to have a lot of data. So on the external side, I see GDP, I see PMI, I see sorts of indicators that you publish in your newspapers and you certainly read. And on the internal side, when I see those positives, I ring Subbu, our great country manager in India. I say, what are we growing at? How are we doing? And everything I get back suggests that the external matches the internal. That's not always the case. And why is it the case in India? Because so many other things about logistics and infrastructure and making things easier for foreign companies to do business, that inward FDI investment. But I've got a one-for-one relationship between what goes on in the external KPIs and what's happening in Subbu's business. And I absolutely see that. And these things go in cycles, but, I've seen great economic growth in India for quite some time, but most notably at the minute.
Right. What kind of capex allocation are you considering?
Well, I don't have the numbers to hand, but I will say a couple of things. When you've got a country of, over 100 facilities, if each one lasts 10 years, then just by pure math, you're doing 10% of the facilities each year. So a lot of money is being spent. We have a big facility in Bengaluru, a new facility up in New Delhi, in my division. Supply chain put, if I'm not wrong, 500 million of investment euros into India 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, more of a long-term plan. So when you've got the infrastructure, hubs, gateways, service centers that we have, literally sort of hundreds of them, let alone digital or fleet plans, on top of Blue Dart Aviation and our aviation assets in India, the investment is heavy. It's one of our larger drawers down on our capital expenditure. Our capex meat and potatoes shopping list for capex is about $1.3 billion a year. And India, without going into detail, definitely gets their fair share of that because that growth is supporting sustainable economic growth going forward.
That's all we have time for here on News Center. Goodbye and thanks for watching.